Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are plumbing the depths of political philosophy with a question that is, well, as infuriating today as it was 5 centuries ago.
It really is.
Why exactly do people consent to their own oppression? We're looking at the ultimate paradox of power, this mystery of why so many choose to serve just one.
We're diving into Étienne de la Boétie's Discourse of Voluntary Servitude. It's a text written way back in the 16th century France, but it basically laid the groundwork for a lot of anti-statist thought.
Right.
La Boétie wasn't really arguing for specific legal reforms, He was going deeper, arguing that the whole structure of despotism itself is fundamentally illegitimate.
Because it relies entirely on what?
On the consent of the governed. That's the core idea.
And La Boétie himself, what a fascinating figure. A French law student, right? Writing this incredibly radical piece around 1550 while he was at Orléans.
Exactly. And he's mostly remembered today, maybe unfairly, as the really close friend of the great essayist Montaigne.
Who published the Discourse after La Boétie's death, I believe.
Yes, though there's some complexity there. But the key thing is, La Boétie's own political insights were, well, explosive for the time.
Especially considering his later career.
Right. It's important for you to understand his context. He actually went on to serve in the Bordeaux Parlement.
Which wasn't like a modern parliament, more like a high court.
Precisely. One of the highest royal courts in France. So he was deeply embedded in the legal and administrative structure of the French monarchy.
But at the same time,
his writing offered this incredibly powerful critique of the principle of monarchy itself, a total rejection of one-man rule based on principle.
So he's navigating the day-to-day intricacies of French royal law, but also penning this abstract, almost timeless argument for liberty.
And that's what makes it so enduring, I think. At the time, many thinkers, especially the Huguenot writers during the religious wars,
they were focused on specific justifications for resistance.
Exactly. Concrete stuff. Historical precedents, biblical arguments for resisting this particular king or that specific policy. La Boétie just sidesteps all of that.
How so?
He doesn't really cite scripture. He doesn't lean on ancient French charters. He focuses almost entirely on universal natural rights. It's based on reason, on deduction.
Framing freedom is just the inherent human condition. Necessary.
Yes. It feels much closer to the kind of thinking you see later in the 18th century Enlightenment than to his contemporaries. Very forward-looking.
Okay, so that structural critique, that focus on principle, brings us straight to his opening observation, which is, frankly, shocking.
It is. He basically just looks around at the world, at the political life he sees.
And sees 1 million men serving in wretchedness, their necks under the yoke. His words.
Ruled by a single person, often not even a particularly impressive person, maybe weak, maybe cowardly.
And he just asks, how? How is this possible? How can one man who possesses, as he says, no more physical power than the least man among the million, how does he dominate them?
And this is the absolute core of the problem for him. He calls it the mystery of civil obedience.
The mystery. Because it doesn't immediately make sense.
Not rationally, no. His crucial insight is that the tyrant doesn't possess some innate magical power. He has, and this is key, no other power than the power they give him.
The people themselves are the source. They're the architects of their own prison, as you said earlier.
Willingly or unwillingly, yes. That's the paradox.
And the most disturbing part, for me at least, is his analysis that this widespread submission, it's rarely just about immediate overwhelming force.
Right. If it were, say, 100 men facing down one really strong warrior tyrant, maybe you could chalk it up to, a failure of nerve. Simple cowardice. Understandable, perhaps.
But that's not what he's seeing.
No. He's seeing entire nations, 1 million men, 100 provinces, submitting to a tyrant whose only real power comes from the network, the structure that they themselves allow him to maintain.
So it's not cowardice anymore, it's something else.
He diagnoses it as a deeper psychological issue, a sort of spiritual sickness. He calls it a monstrous vice.
A monstrous vice. That's strong language.
It is, because for him, it's not just weakness, it's indifference. Or maybe even worse, it's a kind of active consent to suffering. They choose the wretchedness of tyranny over what he sees as the relatively minor effort of resistance.
Wow. That completely shifts the focus, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
We stop asking, how do we find the strength to fight back? And start asking, why on earth do we keep cooperating in the first place?
Exactly. The source of the tyranny isn't ultimately the ruler's strength. It's rooted in the will or the lack of will of the ruled.
Which puts the responsibility, well, squarely on the shoulders of the people being ruled.
It does. It's a challenging diagnosis. It centers the responsibility right there with the individual subject, with the collective populace.
Okay, so let's dig into his philosophical starting point then, this idea of liberty as a foundation. Before we can really grasp why people submit, we need to understand why Boétie thinks liberty is our natural state.
Right. He starts by drawing a distinction. He says, look, it's natural for children to obey their parents. That's intuitive, necessary for survival and learning.
But that changes as we grow.
Yes. As adults, we're supposed to adopt reason as our guide. And if we use reason, if we look at nature itself, what do we see? According to Boétie, we see that we're all fundamentally alike. Cast in the same mold is his phrase.
Meaning we're built for equality.
Essentially. Nature gives us voice, speech, not so one can command and the others obey blindly, but for fraternal relationship, for connection, for mutual support. We're equipped for partnership, not domination.
So the very design of humanity proves, in his view, that we're all naturally free, inasmuch as we are all comrades. Nature didn't intend for some to be masters and others slaves.
That's his bedrock assertion. And this is where he gets quite rhetorical, using the animal kingdom to kind of shame humanity into recognizing its own nature.
Right, he says, even brute beasts cry, long live liberty.
Exactly, as if they understand it better than we do. He uses these vivid examples.
Yeah, I remember those. Like the fish, it dies instantly out of water, proving it needs its natural environment, its freedom to simply exist.
Or the horse, you know. Yeah. It bites the bit, it might obey eventually under constraint, but it clearly shows its protest. It signals that this is unnatural for it.
And the elephant example is quite striking too.
The elephant, yeah.
Yeah.
He brings up this idea, maybe based on travelers' tales or something, that a captured elephant will deliberately break off its own valuable tusks.
Why?
Hoping that the ransom, the value of the ivory, might buy back its freedom. Even creatures we think of as maybe, beasts of burden, they actively resist constraint.
So for Boétie, this proves that freedom isn't just a human idea, it's a deep natural instinct. Even basic creatures fight for it.
Precisely, which makes the human situation even more baffling to him.
So if liberty is so deeply innate, the big question becomes, what on earth has so denatured man, as he puts it? How could humanity, the only creature really born to be free, have somehow lost not just its freedom, but even the memory and the desire for it?
And asking that question leads him directly to his really revolutionary answer about how to overthrow tyranny.
Because if the whole power structure is built on this foundation of consent,
then the solution is, logically, breathtakingly simple. Just withdraw the consent.
Okay, this feels like the real turning point in the argument. He moves from these universal principles about nature and liberty to a practical mechanism, though maybe more psychological than physical.
Very much so. And this is where he importantly departs from the more traditional solution, which was often tyrannicide.
Killing the tyrant.
Right, assassinating the ruler. Boétie sees that as ultimately futile because it usually just replaces one tyrant with another, maybe even a worse one. It doesn't fix the underlying problem of servitude.
So his alternative is?
His conclusion is radical. There is no need of fighting. No violence is required. He argues the tyrant is automatically defeated if the country refuses consent to its own enslavement.
Automatically defeated. Just like that.
Just like that. It's an act of collective, passive refusal. It requires no bloodshed, no complex conspiracy, no weapons, just the will to stop cooperating.
It sounds, well, incredibly elegant. Almost too easy. I mean, doesn't the tyrant still control the guards, the army, the courts, the flow of information? How does just not consenting overcome that?
That's where the specifics of Boétie's idea come in. He stresses that it's about depriving the tyrant of the means to rule. Tyrants need a continuous supply of funds, resources, manpower, all provided by the populace.
So starve the beast.
Essentially, if the populace is simply not obeyed, if they stop paying taxes, stop serving in the administration, stop enforcing his decrees, the entire mechanism of oppression just grinds to a halt.
The tyrant becomes undone and is nothing because his power isn't his own.
Exactly. It's entirely relational. It depends completely on that ongoing flow of cooperation from below.
He uses that powerful image, doesn't he? Saying the tyrant's eyes, his arms, his feet, they're all borrowed from the people.
Yes. He can't spy on you without using your neighbors. He can't beat you without using soldiers drawn from your ranks. He can't trample your fields without using horses fed by your labor. All the instruments of oppression are willingly provided by the subjects themselves.
Which leads to his amazing exhortation that the people need not act nor shed their blood. They don't need to do anything aggressive.
They can overthrow the despot merely by willing to be free. Just make the decision. And this idea is captured perfectly in his most famous metaphor, the Colossus.
Ah, yes. The Colossus. Explain that.
He compares the tyrant to a huge, imposing statue, a colossus. It looks immensely powerful, solid, permanent,
Right.
but its entire stability depends on the pedestal it stands on. And that pedestal is built by the people's compliance, their continued service.
So if you remove the pedestal,
Precisely. If you resolve to serve no more and you are at once freed, the result is inevitable. You don't even have to push the statue over. You
pull the pedestal away.
Yes. And you will behold him like a great colossus whose pedestal has been pulled away, fall of his own weight, and break in pieces.
The power of that image is that it emphasizes structural collapse. It happens automatically once the support is gone. It's not about a direct assault.
Exactly. It's radical because it calls for massive, simultaneous, passive action. It's about collective will, not individual heroics or violence.
You can see why later thinkers, particularly anarchists like Tolstoy, really seized on this work.
Absolutely. They saw La Boétie as providing the first, maybe the purest blueprint for mass nonviolent resistance against the very structure of the state itself, viewing the state as fundamentally incompatible with human liberty.
Okay, so he gives us this elegant nonviolent method. But the puzzle remains, doesn't it? If it's potentially this straightforward, why doesn't it happen more often? Why, for centuries, do people seem to ignore this blueprint and stick with servitude?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it leads directly into the next part of his analysis, how tyranny is maintained after it's initially imposed. How does the psychological decay of the ruled set in?
And he points to a couple of major forces here, right? Custom and then more active manipulation.
Yes. The first, and maybe the most powerful reason servitude endures is just habit, custom, habituation.
How does that work?
Well, imagine a tyranny is first imposed by forced conquest, maybe, or deception. Like he mentions Dionysius of Syracuse, who the people promoted to general during a crisis, only to find he'd made himself a permanent despot.
So the first generation, they feel the loss of freedom.
Keenly. They remember what came before. They feel the yoke. But what about the next generation?
They're born into it. It's all they've ever known.
Exactly. Those who come later, they obey without regret simply because they were born and raised in slavery. For them, servitude is the natural state of affairs. Custom becomes the first reason for voluntary servitude.
Liberty is forgotten because it was never experienced. It's not even a concept for them.
And La Boétie argues this power of habit is so overwhelming, it can actually reshape our nature itself over time.
He uses that great story about Lycurgus and the dogs to illustrate this, doesn't he?
Yes, the Spartan lawgiver Lycurgus. It's a fantastic analogy for the power of nurture over nature.
Remind us how it goes.
Okay, so Lycurgus supposedly takes two puppies from the exact same litter, same parents, same initial nature.
But raises them completely differently.
Totally differently. One is trained for the kitchen, pampered, fed scraps, kept indoors. The other is trained rigorously for the hunt, running, tracking, working hard outdoors.
Then he brings them before the people.
Yes. He sets down a bowl of rich soup, like the kitchen dog is used to, and at the same time releases a live hare, which the hunting dog is trained to chase.
And what happens?
Each dog instinctively goes for what it's been conditioned to value. The kitchen dog ignores the hare and heads straight for the soup bowl. The hunting dog ignores the food and takes off after the hare.
The lesson being?
The lesson is simple but profound. Men are conditioned just like those dogs. Through custom, upbringing, constant reinforcement, people grow accustomed to the idea that they have always been in subjection.
They lose that natural drive for freedom because habit, custom, has completely overlaid their original disposition.
They persuade themselves, maybe unconsciously, by looking around, by imitation, that the ruler somehow has a natural or divine right to command them. Why? Simply because that's the way things have always been done. That's the structure they know.
But it's not just passive forgetfulness, is it? Rulers don't just rely on people getting used to things. They actively work to keep the masses docile.
Oh, absolutely. That's the second major mechanism La Boétie identifies, the deliberate engineering of consent. using distractions, illusions, and material comforts.
Ah, the bread and circus history, would you?
Precisely. He talks about how, for ancient peoples, the rulers used plays, farces, spectacles, gladiators, strange beasts, medals, pictures.
All the shiny objects.
All the shiny objects. These were the bait towards slavery. He says the public learned subservience, the way children learn to read from picture books, they were just mesmerized by the show, distracted from their actual condition.
And the bread part, the material handouts.
Yes, the state buying obedience with largesse. Think of the Roman emperors he mentions. They would distribute a bushel of wheat, a gallon of wine, and a sesterce.
So sesterce, that was like almost nothing, right? A tiny coin.
Practically worthless, maybe a few cents in today's terms. But it was enough. Enough to make people feel taken care of, grateful. They'd cry out famously, "Long live the king," for these pathetic crumbs.
And Boétie's really sharp critique here is that the people completely missed the nature of the transaction.
Totally. They didn't grasp that they were merely recovering a portion of their own property wealth that the ruler had already extracted from them through taxes, plunder, exploitation.
Oh, so they were essentially thanking the thief for giving them back a tiny fraction of their own stolen goods.
It's the ultimate con game. And he gives some pretty damning evidence of how effective this was in just, well, blinding people to reality.
Like the mourning for bad emperors.
Exactly. He points out that the Roman mobs genuinely mourned the deaths of absolute monsters like Nero, even Julius Caesar men who had trampled their liberties, corrupted their laws. Why?
Because they remembered the parties.
Because the memory of the feasts, the games, the handouts was stronger, more potent than the memory of the cruelty and oppression. He describes them as being utterly, dissolutely callous toward their own degradation. Their belly ruled their minds.
It's a pretty bleak picture of human psychology.
It is. But beyond these sort of material distractions and entertainments, tyranny also relies heavily on ideological tools. Mystification, making the ruler seem like more than just a man.
Creating an aura.
Absolutely. Rulers use these psychological devices constantly. First, by co-opting language. He points to how Roman emperors took the sacred title, Tribune of the People.
Which was originally meant to be the people's protector.
Yes. The office created to defend the common citizens against the aristocracy. Emperors grabbed that title to give themselves a veneer of legitimacy, to mask their despotism behind the language of liberty.
Clever, in a cynical way. And the second tactic, deliberate mystery.
Precisely. He mentions the kings of the Assyrians and Medes, who deliberately showed themselves in public very rarely.
Why do that?
To manufacture distance, to encourage the populace, the rabble, as he sometimes calls them, to fill that void with imagination, to start believing the ruler must be somehow superhuman, maybe divine, protected by mystery. It breeds adoration instead of critical thinking.
And the ultimate version of that, of course, is claiming actual divine sanction.
The oldest trick in the book, borrowing a stray bit of divinity, as Boétie puts it, to shield themselves.
I found the historical details he digs up here fascinating, almost bizarre.
They are quite strange. He mentions the legend of Pyrrhus, the king of Epirus, whose big toe supposedly had miraculous healing powers. It could cure spleen diseases just by touching it.
Right, and tyrants staging their own deaths to become gods.
Yeah, ensuring they were deified after death, using that borrowed divinity to protect their reputation, and by extension, the legitimacy of the regime even while they were alive.
It's almost funny how outlandish some of these tactics were. He even brings up the myths surrounding the French kings, doesn't he? With the sacred toads, the fleur-de-lis.
Yes, and he notes, with what seems like very heavy sarcasm, that he certainly wouldn't want to call in question the truth of our traditions because, after all, they provide such wonderful material for French poetry.
The clear implication being that these revered national myths were largely fabricated stories designed specifically to train people in obedience and adoration from birth.
It really leads you to conclude that tyranny isn't just a political system for Boétie. It's a massive, ongoing, multifaceted psychological operation designed to make people forget their natural liberty and accept their chains.
Okay, so custom dulls the senses, propaganda and bread and circuses distract the masses. But that still doesn't fully explain the structural endurance of tyranny. The common people might be duped or passive, but who actively upholds the tyrant day in, day out?
Now we get to what Boétie calls the true mainspring and the secret of domination.
This feels critical.
It is. And this is perhaps his most enduring political insight, something that really goes beyond what many of his contemporaries were focused on. The tyrant, he says, absolutely cannot rule alone. He needs help.
He relies on a network.
A vast formalized hierarchy of vested interests. A network of corrupted people, officials, courtiers, collaborators, who all have an economic and political stake in keeping the tyranny going.
He describes it as a kind of pyramid structure, right? How does that work? How does it bind potentially millions to one despot?
It starts small, right at the top, with maybe 5 or 6 chief favorites, the inner circle. These are the people closest to the dictator who have his ear, his trust, or, at least his temporary favor.
But it doesn't stop there.
Not at all. These 5 or 6, they need their own support system. So they, in turn, maintain maybe 600 subordinates beneath them.
And what do these 600 get?
They get the good stuff. Powerful positions in government, control over finances, opportunities for large-scale plunder. They owe their position entirely to the favor of the top 5 or 6.
And it keeps cascading down.
Exactly. Those 600 then need their enforcers and administrators. So they support 6,000 under them, the local governors, the tax collectors, the petty officials who carry out the day-to-day avarice and cruelty at the ground level.
And these 6,000 need the 600 above them.
They absolutely do. They need the protection, the shadow of the 600 to get away with their own minor tyrannies and corruption. Without that connection higher up, they'd be vulnerable.
So the chain just keeps growing.
Until, as Boétie estimates, potentially 100,000 and even millions cling to the tyrant by this cord. It's not just the tyrant, it's the entire apparatus.
So tyranny isn't just one person ruling millions. It's a massive system of patronage and organized corruption.
It is the ultimate pyramid scheme, you could say. He calls these collaborators the wicked dregs of the nation, people who actively gather around the dictator, not out of loyalty necessarily, but to have a share in the booty.
To get their piece of the pie.
Exactly. They get permission, essentially, to commit their own evils, not against the despot himself, of course, but against the general populace below them.
And the key strategy here?
The key strategy is that the despot subdues his subjects, some of them by means of others. He uses the ambition and greed of one part of the population to control the rest, like using a wedge of the wood itself to split the log. He divides and conquers by creating these layers of petty chiefs, all eager for plunder and loyal only upwards.
Okay, on the surface, this sounds like a pretty sweet deal for those courtiers, those favorites, those hundreds and thousands in the network. They get wealth, status, power over others.
It looks good from the outside.
But Boétie argues, quite forcefully, that their lives are actually worse than the poor peasant they're trampling on. Why? That seems counterintuitive.
He argues, definitively, that their lives are infinitely more wretched, more psychologically tormented.
How so?
Well, think about it. The peasant, however enslaved, he knows his task. He receives an order, he does it, his obligation is discharged, maybe he has some peace. The favorites, though, their job is never done. They have to constantly anticipate every whim, every mood swing of the tyrant.
Second-guessing everything.
Constantly. They must neglect their preference for his, suppress their own personalities, distort their character to perfectly mirror whatever the tyrant wants them to be in that moment. It's a performance that never ends.
They live, as he vividly puts it, in constant and perpetual fear.
Absolutely. Fear of falling out of favor, fear of rivals, fear of the tyrant's paranoia. They have ultimately nothing to call one's own, not even their own thoughts or feelings, really.
And their proximity to power is actually their biggest danger.
It's their greatest vulnerability. Boétie points out that possessing great wealth, which they strive for, ironically becomes the worst crime against the tyrant. Why? Because the tyrant is always greedy, always suspicious. The rich are eventually ruined, often executed, simply so the tyrant can confiscate their spoils. Their very success makes them a target.
He gives some pretty chilling historical examples to back this up, doesn't he? Cases where extreme loyalty meant nothing.
Oh, definitely. Think of Seneca, Burrus, Thrasea. These weren't just random courtiers. They were brilliant philosophers, powerful military commanders, stoic senators, close advisors to Emperor Nero.
And yet
Nero had them all executed or forced them into suicide. The moment their advice became inconvenient or the moment he needed a scapegoat, their proximity and past service counted for absolutely nothing.
Even family ties offered no safety net.
None whatsoever. Nero murdered his own wife, Poppaea, apparently by kicking her when she was pregnant. He murdered his own mother, Agrippina. Claudius, another emperor, murdered his wife, Messalina. The history is brutal.
So the chilling lesson for anyone in that inner circle is, you live in a state of constant psychological terror. You are always potentially just one bad mood, one paranoid suspicion away from utter ruin or death.
And that's because, as Boétie argues, true friendship is a sacred word. It requires equality, mutual respect, integrity, sincerity.
Things impossible under tyranny.
Impossible where there is systemic cruelty, calculated betrayal, and inherent inequality. What exists among the tyrant and his favorites isn't friendship. It's just a temporary conspiracy held together entirely by fear and the pursuit of mutual temporary gain.
But so even the people who seem to benefit most from the system are, in reality, deeply miserable and insecure.
Yeah.
And they don't even get public sympathy.
Not a chance. They're universally hated by the general population. The people blame the favorites, the advisors, the ministers for all the misfortunes, the high taxes, the famines, the wars, the pestilences.
They become the scapegoats.
Always. And when the tyrant eventually falls, as they often do, it's usually the favorites who are the first targets for public retribution, torn apart by the mob. Their only lasting reward is infamy and misery.
Boétie really makes a powerful psychological case that if only these favored few could truly recognize their own precarious, miserable position,
they might be the first ones to want to break the chain, to withdraw their own crucial support from the tyrant. Their self-interest, properly understood, lies in dismantling the system that enslaves them too.
That potential realization, that awakening within the hierarchy itself, must be a key target for anyone wanting to achieve freedom nonviolently.
Which brings us really to the final piece of the puzzle. Who keeps the flame of liberty alive when custom and corruption seem so overwhelming? And how can they activate that mass withdrawal of consent?
Boétie does identify a specific group, doesn't he? Even after generations of servitude, propaganda, and this whole corrupt network, there's always a segment of society that resists, at least intellectually.
Yes, he talks about the knowledgeable elite, the intellectuals, the readers, the thinkers.
How does he define this group? Is it about wealth or status?
Not necessarily. He defines this vanguard primarily by their intellect and their awareness. They are a few, better endowed than others, who simply refuse to be fully conditioned by habit and propaganda.
They think for themselves.
They think for themselves. They use history. They use reason. They look behind and before, comparing the past with the present, judging in their current condition against the standard of natural liberty.
And these are the people who, even if liberty completely vanished from the earth,
they'd be compelled by their own minds, by their understanding of nature and reason, to invent it all over again. Their minds simply cannot accept servitude as natural or just.
These are the individuals who train their minds through study, through learning. That gives them the insight to see tyranny for what it is, and crucially, to detest it.
And this is precisely why, Boétie points out, tyrants almost invariably try to suppress education, control information, burn books.
Because knowledge is dangerous to them.
Inherently dangerous. The tyrant knows that books, history, philosophy, they all provide the necessary contrast to the myths and lies he uses to maintain power. The free, educated mind is the ultimate fundamental threat to tyranny.
But he also notes that this intellectual resistance is often kind of ineffective, at least on its own. Why?
Because under a strong tyranny, these knowledgeable individuals are often isolated from each other. They lose the freedom to act together, freedom of speech, even freedom of thought becomes risky. They end up alone in their aspirations, unable to coordinate or mobilize.
Almost foreshadowing analyses of 20th century totalitarianism there.
It really does feel that way. The suppression is psychological as much as physical.
So given this isolation, what is the task of this knowledgeable elite? How can they make a difference?
Their task is fundamentally intellectual, educational. It's about reaching the broader public. It's about debamboozling them, as later thinkers might put it.
Debamboozling.
Yes. Revealing the myths the state promotes. Exposing the lies. Showing the true, miserable reality of life within the tyrant's hierarchy, even for the favorites. Explaining the mechanism of voluntary servitude itself.
Encouraging the masses to finally take that step.
Encouraging them to make that conscious decision to withdraw the consent that the entire structure depends upon. They need to provide the intellectual fuel, the understanding, the arguments that can ignite that revolution of the will, maybe even encourage parts of the hierarchy itself to defect.
So, bringing this all together, what does this incredibly insightful 16th century treatise really teach us about the dynamics of state power today in the 21st century?
I think Boétie's core insight is absolutely timeless, because the fundamental principle hasn't changed. The power of any government, democratic or despotic, ultimately rests on the ongoing cooperation and obedience of its citizens. Maybe not always active consent, but at least passive compliance.
So the primary task for anyone who values liberty, who maybe questions the scope of state power,
is fundamentally intellectual and psychological. It's about education. It's about constantly working to de-bamboozle the public, to pull back the curtain.
and to expose the state, not just as, an entity that sometimes makes policy errors or has inefficiencies.
But potentially, as Boétie saw it, as a mighty structural engine of exploitation, economic, political, psychological, that survives primarily by engineering consent, by playing on our desire for security, and by exploiting the sheer deadening weight of habit and conformity.
Which requires, then, a certain kind of individual courage.
Tremendous courage. The courage to think for yourself, to question the status quo, to reject the easy comfort of just going along with things because that's how it's always been done, and to realize that the moment we collectively stop serving,
the borrowed power of that colossus just evaporates.
That's the potential. If his analysis holds, then liberty is always, at least theoretically, just one collective decision away, a decision to stop participating in our own servitude.
And that brings us back finally to the power of habit, which seemed like such a negative force earlier.
Yes, but think about the flip side. Boétie argues that habit is what sustains tyranny. Once people are used to it, it feels normal. But what if, through some mass withdrawal of consent, state despotism were actually removed?
The habit would be broken.
The bulwark of habit, those generations of conditioned obedience, would crumble. Statism, or at least excessive state power, might then be seen much more clearly for what it is. A system of control and exploitation, stripped bare of its myths and justifications.
Which leads to a rather provocative final thought for you, the listener, to perhaps bowl over.
If that habit of obedience were truly broken, the chances for a genuinely free society to actually maintain itself might be much better than we think. Statism wouldn't have that deep-rooted psychological advantage anymore.
Provided, of course.
Provided that the knowledgeable elite, those who understand and value liberty, manage to keep the memory alive, keep the understanding clear, and possess the tools to educate future generations.
The strength of any free society, then, rests ultimately on the ongoing courage of individuals to break that custom of conformity, to think critically, and to choose freedom over servitude.
So the question Boétie leaves us with, perhaps, is, what aspect of unquestioned authority, what form of voluntary servitude in your own life or society are you willing to withdraw your consent from today?
A powerful question indeed. Well, that's about all the time we have. You've been listening to the deep dive from Wake Up and Smell the Freedom, where ideas percolate. Thanks for joining us as we continue to explore the ideas that shaped liberty and continue to shape us today. Remember, the pursuit of liberty begins with understanding, and understanding begins with asking the right questions. Until next time.
Bye-bye.